Good evening, dear listener, or perhaps good morning if you're enjoying this with your first cup of tea. Pull your armchair a little closer. You are cordially invited back to the sleepy English village of St. Mary Mead, sometime in the gentle autumn of 1951 where nothing ever happens. Until, of course, it does. Tonight we return to that quiet cottage at the end of the lane and to the sharpest pair of pale blue eyes in all of England. Welcome to Miss Marple and the Village Well Discovery. Chapter 1. The Wish That Went Wrong. The village of St. Mary Mead lay sleeping under a soft September mist, the kind that rises from the little stream behind the vicarage and drifts across the meadows like a lace curtain drawn by an idle hand. It was the 26th of September, 1951, a Tuesday, and the war was 6 years distant now, far enough away that people had begun once more to speak of rationing in the past tense, and to plant dahlias instead of potatoes in their front gardens. The church clock struck 8 with its usual apologetic cough, and the day began as peacefully as any other. At 8:20, Tommy Pierce shot out of his mother's cottage in Milchester Lane, whistling shrilly through the gap where his front tooth had been the week before. Tommy was 14, freckled, and possessed of more energy than sense. He had been promised a shilling by Clarence, the butcher's boy, if he would climb down the old wishing well and retrieve the sixpence Clarence swore he had seen glinting at the bottom the evening before. Tommy needed the shilling rather badly. His mother had threatened to take the strap to him if he came home again without the money for a new pair of football boots. The wishing well stood at the junction where the lane from the vicarage met the footpath to the Blue Boar. It was a pretty thing, built of mellow gray stone in the reign of Queen Anne, with a little pointed roof and a worn oak bucket that had not held water for 100 years. Ivy clung to its sides and heartsease grew in the crevices. Generations of villagers had dropped pennies into its depths and whispered their heart's desires for a sweetheart to return from the sea, for a child to be born healthy, for the cows to give more milk. The well had never been known to grant a single wish, but it had also never been known to give anything back, until this morning. Tommy arrived breathless, Clarence lounging against the stonework with folded arms and a superior smile. A small knot of younger boys hovered at a safe distance, ready to run at the first sign of adult interference. Tommy tested the ancient rope that hung from the windlass. It was thick, tarred, and looked sound enough. He tied it twice around his waist, gave Clarence a look of pure scorn, and swung himself over the coping. The descent was darker and damper than he had expected. Ferns brushed his face. The stones were slimy under his palms. Down and down he went, the circle of daylight above, shrinking to the size of a sixpence, then to a farthing. The air smelled of earth and iron and something faintly sweet like decaying apples. His boots scraped the curved wall. 10 feet, 12, 15. Then his foot touched something that was not stone. He looked down. A woman's hand, gloved in dove-gray kid, floated just beneath the surface of the black water. The fingers were slightly curved, as though the owner had been about to wave. A single white rose lay on the water beside it, turning gently like a lazy boat. Tommy opened his mouth and screamed. The sound echoed up the shaft like a trapped bird. He scrabbled at the rope, hauled himself upward in a panic of elbows and knees, and tumbled over the coping stone into Clarence's astonished arms. For a moment he could only point and gibber. Then he found his voice. "There's a lady down there, a dead 'un. I touched her hand." Clarence, whose bravado had evaporated, needed no further encouragement. He took to his heels toward the police house, shouting at the top of his lungs. Tommy, not to be outdone, ran in the opposite direction toward the high street, yelling that the well had eaten Mrs. Chelmsford and spat out her hand like a fishbone. By the time P.C. Polk arrived, panting and buttoning his tunic, half the village seemed to have gathered. Mrs. Price Ridley was there in her pre-war tweeds, clutching her shopping basket as though it were a shield. Miss Hartnell, upright and military in her green coat, stood with lips tightly compressed. The vicar, dear Leonard Clement, hovered ineffectually, murmuring texts about resurrection and the latter day. Even old Mr. Pinker, who was stone-deaf and rarely noticed anything short of an earthquake, had been tugged along by his housekeeper. P.C. Pauk peered cautiously over the rim. The mist had lifted a little, and the sun, now fully up, struck a shaft of pale gold straight down the well shaft. The gloved hand was still there, motionless, the white rose turning slowly beside it. "Lord preserve us," said Pauk, removing his helmet and scratching his head. "That'll be Mrs. Chelmsford right enough. Nobody else in the parish wears gloves that color after September the 1st. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a small, satisfied nod, as though having her worst fears confirmed was a positive pleasure. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes later, escorted by Cherry Baker, who had been sent post-haste from the baker's shop with the news. Miss Marple walked slowly, leaning on her stick, but her pale blue eyes were bright with interest. She greeted the little crowd with her usual gentle murmur, "Good morning, Mrs. Price Ridley. Dear Vicar, such a shocking thing," and made her way to the front with the calm authority of a duchess at a garden party. She looked down into the well for a long moment. No one spoke. Even the children had fallen silent. The hand floated palm upward, the fingers relaxed. The glove was buttoned neatly at the wrist. There was no sign of a struggle on the stones around the well. On the coping lay a single white rose, freshly picked, its petals still dewed. Miss Marple noticed that the dew was on the upper side of the petals only, as though the flower had been placed there after the mist had begun to lift. "Curious," she said softly. Dr. Haydock's Morris Minor drew up with a squeak of brakes. The doctor, a tall Scot with a permanently worried expression, climbed out carrying his bag and stethoscope. "Morning, Pauk. What's all this?" He peered over the edge, gave a low whistle, and turned to the constable. "We'll need a longer rope and a couple of strong lads. Gently does it." While the rope was being fetched from the vicarage garage, Miss Marple moved quietly around the well. She examined the gravel path, the patch of grass where lovers sometimes sat on summer evenings, the low stone bench dedicated to the memory of Alderman J.P. Carstairs, who had died in 1919. Nothing appeared disturbed. There were no footprints in the soft earth bordering the gravel, no drag marks, no scattered petals from the rose. Cherry, round-eyed, whispered, "Do you think she fell, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was watching Colonel Bantry arrive in a flurry of military indignation, demanding to know why nobody had telephoned him. "Because you haven't got a telephone, Colonel," said Miss Hartnell smartly. The Colonel harumphed and joined the circle. His mustache bristled at the sight of the floating hand. "Disgraceful," he pronounced. "Place isn't safe. Ought to be covered over. I said so to the parish council only last Michaelmas." The rope arrived. 2 young farmers, brothers named Hogg, volunteered to go down. With much creaking of the windlass and muttered encouragement from the crowd, the body was slowly raised. First the hand, then the arm in its dove-gray sleeve, then the shoulder and the calm, composed face of Mrs. Laura Chelmsford. She might have been asleep. Her iron-gray hair was neatly waved. Her small hat of navy velvet sat straight. Only the pallor of her skin and the unnatural angle of her head told another story. When they laid her gently on the grass, her right hand was seen to be tightly closed around something. Dr. Haydock opened the fingers with care. A silver sixpence gleamed in her palm, bright as the day it was minted. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a little gasp. She always said she'd leave a coin for luck when she went. But in the well? Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Melodramatic, I call it. Miss Marple bent closer. The sixpence was new, 1951, and across the king's cheek someone had scratched a tiny cross with a sharp point. She straightened slowly, her face thoughtful. Dr. Haydock completed his brief examination. Dead several hours, I'd say. No sign of violence that I can see here. We'll know more later. He looked at P.C. Polk. Better telephone the coroner, and perhaps Scotland Yard. We'll take an interest. Drowning in the village well isn't exactly commonplace. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low, excited voices. Miss Marple lingered. She looked once more at the white rose lying on the coping stone, at the sixpence now reposing in Dr. Haydock's waistcoat pocket, at the serene face of the dead woman. Cherry ventured. It might have been an accident, mightn't it? She leaned over too far. Miss Marple's lips curved in the gentlest of smiles. My dear, people do not usually stun themselves unconscious on the back of the head before falling into wells, and they rarely pick white roses at midnight in September. Cherry's eyes grew rounder than ever. Then, murder? Miss Marple tucked her hand into Cherry's arm and turned toward home. Let us say rather that someone has granted Mrs. Chelmsford her final wish, whether she made it or not. And with that quiet sentence hanging in the autumn air, the little tragedy of St. Mary Mead began. Chapter 2. The Five Who Might Have Wished. By the time Miss Marple reached her small, immaculate cottage in Downmead Lane, the church clock was chiming 11, and Cherry had already set the kettle on the Rayburn and laid out the best Royal Albert cups as though for a vicarage tea party. News travels faster than light in St. Mary Mead, and half the village seemed to have found an excuse to pass the gate in the hope of learning more. Miss Marple, however, closed the door firmly, drew the curtains a modest inch against prying eyes, and settled herself in her favorite armchair with the air of a general preparing to study a map. Cherry, pink with importance, poured boiling water into the brown teapot and began her recital without waiting to be asked. They're saying it was murder, Miss Marple, plain as plain. And there's 5 people glad Mrs. Chelmsford's gone. Well, perhaps not glad, but not sorry neither. Mrs. Price Ridley told Mrs. Baker, who told Mr. Baker, who told me while I was buying the currant loaf. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. 5, you say? Do let us have them in order, Cherry dear, like the groceries. Cherry counted on her fingers. First, Colonel Bantry. You know how he and Mrs. Chelmsford quarreled over that strip of garden by the fence. He swore she'd moved the boundary pegs while he was away in Scotland last August, and he called her, well, words I wouldn't repeat. Threatened to take her to court, he did, and everybody heard him at the parish council. Miss Marple inclined her head. The colonel is loud, certainly. Go on. Second, Miss Caroline Weatherby. Cherry lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She's been writing anonymous letters. Mrs. Bantry found one in her milk bottles only last month, saying dreadful things about Mrs. Chelmsford leading a certain gentleman astray. Meaning the colonel, of course. Miss Weatherby thinks she's the guardian of village morals. She was furious. When Mrs. Chelmsford subscribed to that London magazine with the pictures. Artistic Studies, I believe they were called, murmured Miss Marple. Cherry sniffed. Nude ones, Mrs. Baker says. Anyway, Miss Weatherby told the vicar's wife that something ought to be done about that woman before she corrupted the entire neighborhood. Dear me, said Miss Marple mildly. Number 3? Mr. Ronald Thompson, the painter fellow in the tithe barn. Ever so handsome, but no better than he should be. Mrs. Chelmsford was paying for his paints and canvases and heaven knows what else. Tongues were wagging something dreadful. Then last week they had a proper set to in the lane. Gladys heard them from the scullery window. He shouted that she was trying to own him body and soul, and she shouted back that ungrateful puppies got whipped. Or something like that. Miss Marple poured herself a little milk. Artists are sensitive creatures, and the fourth? Gladys Brent herself, Mrs. Chelmsford's maid. She was given the sack on Saturday without a character. Mrs. Chelmsford said she'd been listening at doors and repeating things. Gladys went storming off to her aunt at the Blue Boar, crying that she'd make Madam sorry one day, and everybody heard that too. She's a nervy girl. You never know what nervy girls will do. Indeed one doesn't, agreed Miss Marple. And the fifth? Mr. Alfred Crackenthorpe, Mrs. Chelmsford's brother-in-law from London. He came down on Friday in a nasty temper, staying at the Blue Boar because she wouldn't have him in the house. Something about the will. Mrs. Chelmsford told Miss Hartnell she was cutting him out altogether because he'd been sponging ever since poor Mr. Chelmsford died. He was heard telling the barman that his sister-in-law would live to regret it, or not live, maybe. The barman thought it was a joke, but you know what solicitors are. Miss Marple set her cup in its saucer with the faintest chink. 5 people, she repeated softly, each with what the newspapers call a motive. Yet motive, Cherry, is the easiest thing in the world to acquire. It is opportunity that is rare and method rarer still. Cherry looked puzzled. But one of them must have done it, mustn't they? Possibly, said Miss Marple, or possibly someone we have not yet considered. Human wickedness, my dear, is like bindweed. It flourishes in the most unexpected corners. At that moment the front door knocker sounded, 3 brisk raps. Cherry flew to answer it and returned, followed by Inspector Dermot Craddock, hat in hand, trying to look as though he had just dropped in for a cup of tea and not, as was perfectly plain, to pick Miss Marple's brains. "Morning, Aunt Jane," he said cheerfully. He always called her that, though the relationship was distant and complicated. "Thought I'd find you at the center of things as usual." Miss Marple greeted him with real pleasure. "Dermot, dear, how nice. Cherry, another cup. The inspector will take 2 sugars, I believe, and no milk." Inspector Craddock accepted the cup gratefully and came straight to the point. "We'll have the full post-mortem this afternoon, but Haydock's pretty certain she was stunned before she went into the water. Bruise at the base of the skull. And there's something odd about the gloves. One missing, and the one we found floating was buttoned, which is peculiar if she was clutching the 6pence so tightly." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "You noticed that too?" I wondered if anyone would. Craddock grinned ruefully. "I've learned to notice what you notice, Aunt Jane. The point is, this is murder, and I'm expected to solve it before the newspapers get hold of the wishing well horror. The chief constable is already twitching." "Then we must try to calm him," said Miss Marple serenely. "Tell me, Dermot, did you happen to observe the white rose on the coping stone?" Craddock looked blank. "Rose? I don't think so." "Ah," said Miss Marple and reached for her knitting again. "Then perhaps you will walk down there later and look more carefully. White roses in September are not picked by accident. And while you are about it, you might ask yourself why Mrs. Chelmsford, who was a most methodical woman, should choose to make a wish at midnight when she had a perfectly good mirror at home in which to drop her 6pence, as sensible people do." Inspector Craddock opened his mouth, closed it again, and drank his tea in one gulp. "I'll be off then," he said, standing. "But you'll let me know if anything occurs to you?" "My dear boy," said Miss Marple, "I am only an old maid who knits. What could possibly occur to me?" The inspector departed, shaking his head, and Cherry closed the door behind him with a beaming smile. Outside in the lane, the newsboys from Much Benham were already shouting about the village well mystery, and somewhere a woman was crying quietly behind lace curtains. St. Mary Mead had woken properly now, and the little drama was only just beginning. Chapter 3. Tea, Gossip, and a Torn Theater Ticket. The following afternoon was one of those soft golden days that September sometimes bestows as an apology for the winter that is already waiting in the wings. Miss Marple, wearing her old gray coat and the neat black straw hat she kept for afternoon visits, set out along the high street with the deliberate pace of someone who has no intention of hurrying yet will still arrive exactly on time. Her destination was the vicarage where Griselda Clement had telephoned to beg her to come to tea and help calm Leonard's nerves. The vicar, dear man, always took village tragedies as a personal rebuke from Providence. Miss Marple paused first at Mrs. Butt's little shop for a quarter-pound of the best butter and a packet of arrowroot biscuits, small offerings that would save Griselda the embarrassment of producing shop cake when unexpected callers descended. While Mrs. Butt weighed and wrapped, she talked, of course. Such a shock, Miss Marple, poor Mrs. Chelmsford. Though between you and me and the gatepost she did like to make herself the center of attention, going off to the theater all alone on Monday night, bold as brass. The Much Benham players, amateur of course, they were doing that dreadful modern piece with the French name. Lettice's husband drove her to the bus stop himself at 6:30. Said she was in ever such high spirits. Miss Marple received her parcel and her change. Was she indeed? How interesting. She continued on her way, noting, as she always did, the small domestic tableau. Mrs. Harmony sweeping her front step and pretending not to watch who went in and out of the Blue Boar. Young Mrs. Lester hanging nappies on the line with one eye on her toddler. Mr. Elliot the chemist polishing his brass plate with rather more vigor than usual. At the vicarage, Griselda opened the door herself, fair hair escaping from its pins, cheeks flushed from the aga. Jane, thank heavens. Leonard has been composing a sermon on the uncertainty of life since breakfast, and it's perfectly morbid. Come in, come in. Kettle's on. The drawing-room was its usual comfortable muddle of books, dogs, and half-finished tapestries. The vicar rose from his desk, spectacles fogged with earnestness. My dear Miss Marple, a terrible business. I feel I ought to have called upon Mrs. Chelmsford more often, though she did not come to church as regularly as one might wish. Griselda poured tea strong enough to stand a spoon in and pass the seed cake. Leonard, darling, you called every time she had a cold for the last 10 years. Now eat something before you fade away. Between them, with the gentle persistence of water-wearing stone, Miss Marple extracted the small nuggets she required. Yes, Mrs. Chelmsford had taken the 6:30 bus to Much Benham on Monday evening. Lettice Prothero's husband had driven her to the stop. She had been wearing her navy coat with the squirrel collar and carrying a little velvet bag with her theater things. She had returned on the last bus, the 11:17, alighting at the crossroads just after 11:30. The conductor remembered her perfectly because she had dropped her glove getting down and he had to run after her with it. And then, said Griselda, lowering her voice, although the maid was safely in the kitchen, old Mr. Finch, who lives in the cottage opposite the well, swears he saw her walking in that direction at 11:55, alone. Said she had a white flower pinned to her coat. He noticed because the bus had woken him and he couldn't get back to sleep. Miss Marple sipped her tea. A white rose, perhaps? Griselda stared. Why, yes, I believe it was. How did you know? Miss Marple merely smiled and accepted another slice of cake. After leaving the vicarage, she turned her steps toward Gossington Lane and the house of Mrs. Price Ridley, who was famous for 3 things: her rheumatism, her sharp tongue, and her inability to let any scrap of information pass without comment. Mrs. Price Ridley received her in the drawing-room that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and superiority. The fire was newly laid. The brass companion set gleamed with recent polishing. They spoke first of the Harvest Festival arrangements, then of the shocking ingratitude of domestic servants, and only then, by way of a natural transition, did Mrs. Price Ridley approach the subject that occupied every mind. Of course, Caroline Weatherby is prostrate. She and Laura Chelmsford were at school together, you know, though they haven't been close these many years. Caroline went to the theater on Monday, too. Same performance. Came home early with one of her heads. Most unlike her to waste good money. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fireplace. A small heap of ash lay in the grate, and among it the corner of something crimson protruded. Stiff paper, half burned. She leaned forward as though to warm her hands, and with the dexterity of long practice, eased the fragment free with the toe of her shoe while appearing merely to shift her position. "Such a pity about the theater," she murmured. "I believe the play was rather daring." Mrs. Price Ridley snorted. "French nonsense." Caroline said the second act gave her the migraine. She was home by 10 o'clock and took aspirin and went straight to bed. Her maid can vouch for it. "How fortunate that someone can vouch for everyone," said Miss Marple gently. She took her leave soon afterward, the tiny scrap of crimson card, clearly the corner of a theater ticket for Monday 24th September, seat J12, safely transferred to her handbag when Mrs. Price Ridley turned to ring for the maid. Walking home through the quiet lanes, Miss Marple reflected. Mrs. Chelmsford had left the theater after the performance, taken the bus, alighted at 11:30, and walked toward the well. Miss Weatherby had left early, or said she had, and burned her ticket. Someone had placed a white rose on the coping stone after the mist had begun to lift, for the dew lay only on the upper petals. And someone had stunned a woman, lowered her carefully into 10 feet of water, and arranged her hand to float like Ophelia's. All most interesting. At the crossroads, she paused and looked toward the well. The police had placed a temporary barricade around it, and a young constable stood guard, looking cold and self-conscious. A small bunch of late Michaelmas daisies had already been laid against the stones, village sentiment beginning its gentle work of forgiveness. Miss Marple walked on, in her mind the little pieces, bus times, white roses, a torn ticket, a missing glove, turned slowly like the bright fragments in a kaleidoscope, waiting for the one small twist that would make them fall into a picture. She smiled to herself. There was no hurry. In St. Mary Mead, secrets always come home to roost in the end. Chapter 4. The Matter of the Missing Gloves. Dr. Haydock's surgery lay at the far end of the high street, a square red brick house with a brass plate and a waiting room that smelled of iodine and damp dog. On Thursday morning, Miss Marple presented herself at 10 o'clock precisely, complaining of a slight twinge in her knitting shoulder. The doctor, who had known her for 40 years and had never yet succeeded in persuading her to take anything stronger than aspirin, greeted her with resigned affection. Come in, Miss Marple. I suppose you want to know about poor Mrs. Chelmsford." "Only if it will not breach professional confidence, Doctor dear." Haydock gave a short laugh. "I've had half the village in here this morning with imaginary ailments. You might as well have the facts straight." He closed the door and lowered his voice. "Death by drowning, but very little water in the lungs. She was unconscious when she entered the well. A single blow to the occiput, quite sharp, probably the edge of the iron bucket that hangs there. No other marks of violence. Time of death between 11:45 and 1 o'clock, and the right glove is missing." Miss Marple nodded. "I noticed only one glove floating. The left, I believe." "Exactly. The one we recovered was buttoned at the wrist, yet her right hand was clenched round that sixpence as though she had been holding it when she was struck. Try clenching your fist hard while wearing tight kid gloves, Miss Marple." Miss Marple obediently closed her small hand. The kid glove she wore for best, pale lavender, almost white, creased deeply but did not prevent a firm grip. "Yet the glove was buttoned," Haydock repeated, "which suggests either that it was put on after death or that the sixpence was placed in her hand afterwards. Both impossible if she fell by accident." Or if she was murdered in the usual hurried way, said Miss Marple quietly. This was arranged, Doctor. Someone took trouble. Haydock rubbed his chin. There's more. A trace of chloral hydrate in the stomach contents. Not enough to kill, but enough to make her sleepy, confused. She may have taken a dose herself for nerves. She was a great one for tablets. Or someone gave it to her. Miss Marple thanked him gravely and departed. Her twinge miraculously improved. Her next visit was to the Blue Boar, where Gladys Brent sat in the private parlor, red-eyed and clutching a damp handkerchief. The girl rose nervously when Miss Marple entered. "Oh, miss, it's good of you to come. Aunt said I wasn't to speak to anyone, but you're different, you always understand." Miss Marple patted the sofa beside her. "Sit down, child, and tell me everything from the beginning." Gladys needed no second invitation. Words poured out like water from a broken dam. Madam had been that difficult these last weeks, always finding fault, counting the lumps of coal, complaining the sheets weren't aired properly. And then the business of the will. She told me herself, miss, last Friday when I was doing her hair. Said she was going to London next week to see Mr. Curtis at the bank and cut Mr. Alfred out altogether. And Mr. Ronald was to have the little annuity instead. "That'll teach ungrateful relatives," she said, and laughed something dreadful. I told her it wasn't right, Mr. Alfred being family, and she slapped my face and said I was an impudent chit and to pack my boxes. Gladys dabbed her eyes. "I never meant any harm, miss, truly. I only said I'd tell what I knew about her and Mr. Ronald if she didn't give me a reference. I was that upset." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And what exactly did you know, Gladys?" The girl flushed scarlet. "Nothing like people think. Only that he painted her without all her clothes for one of them art pictures. She kept it hidden behind the spare room curtain. Said it was Greek mythology or some such. And she was going to leave him money if he'd marry her, only he laughed and said he wasn't the marrying sort." Miss Marple nodded. "And the gloves, Gladys? Mrs. Chelmsford was very particular about gloves." "Oh, yes, miss. She had 2 pairs exactly alike. Dove-gray kid, real leather, from Daniel Neal in Oxford Street. She kept the second pair in the table drawer in the hall in case she dirtied the first. Always said a lady is never without gloves." Miss Marple rose. "Thank you, my dear. You have been most helpful." Outside in the inn-yard, she paused, considering. 2 pairs of identical gloves, one glove floating, buttoned, one missing entirely, and a woman who would never have left the house with odd gloves even at midnight. She decided to call upon Colonel Bantry. The Colonel's house stood next to what had been Mrs. Chelmsford's, larch trees and the laurels, divided by a tall beech hedge and a good deal of ill-feeling. The Colonel was in his garden, savagely pruning a rose that had done him no harm. "Morning, Miss Marple. Beastly business. Can't think who'd want to harm the woman, though between ourselves she was deuced annoying about that boundary." Miss Marple admired the rose for a polite interval, then asked whether he had happened to notice anything unusual on Monday night. "Bridge at the vicarage till 1:45, barked the Colonel. "Clement will vouch for me. Lost 6 shillings to him, worse luck. Got home, went to bed. Didn't hear a thing till young Tommy started yelling blue murder yesterday morning." Miss Marple thanked him and drifted toward the hedge. A narrow gap gave a view of Mrs. Chelmsford's garden, neat, orderly, the flower beds newly dug. A small heap of wilted white roses lay on the compost, their stems cut with secateurs. She noted the cut was slanting from upper left to lower right, the way a right-handed person would cut if standing facing the bush. On the way home, she passed the chemist's. Mr. Elliot, small and precise behind his counter, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I expect you'll be wanting your usual winter tonic?" "Not today, thank you, Mr. Elliot. Tell me, did Mrs. Chelmsford by any chance purchase sleeping tablets recently? Mr. Elliot consulted his poisons book. Yes, indeed. Chloral hydrate, 12 cachets on the 19th. Said her nerves were poorly after the hot summer. Miss Marple thanked him and stepped back into the sunlight. So chloral in the stomach, 2 pairs of identical gloves, white roses cut by a right-handed person, and a woman walking toward the well at midnight with a flower pinned to her coat and presumably a confused head. She walked on, her umbrella tapping gently on the pavement like a thoughtful metronome. Somewhere in these small, ordinary facts lay the shape of a murder, neat and tidy and cruel, committed by someone who knew Mrs. Chelmsford's habits almost as well as Mrs. Chelmsford herself. And that, thought Miss Marple, was the most interesting observation of all. Chapter 5. The Artist's Studio. The old tithe barn stood at the end of a rutted track beyond the church, its red tiles patched with moss, and its great doors permanently ajar. Ronald Thompson had taken it 2 years earlier when the farmer gave up storing hay, and he had turned the cool, shadowed interior into a studio that smelled of linseed oil, turpentine, and Gauloise's cigarettes. On Friday afternoon, with a pale sun struggling through the high windows, Miss Marple arrived unannounced, leaning lightly on her stick and carrying a small basket covered by a linen cloth. Ronald was at work on a large canvas, a stormy sky above the downs, all bruised purples and racing grays. He wore a fisherman's jersey, much paint spattered, and his dark hair fell over one eye in the approved artistic manner. When he saw Miss Marple, he put down his brush with every appearance of pleasure. Miss Marple, the very person. I was about to make coffee, real coffee smuggled from Soho. You will rescue me from solitary brooding. Miss Marple accepted both the wooden chair he dusted for her and the thick cup of coffee that tasted of chicory and danger. I have come, Mr. Thompson, partly to offer sympathy and partly, well, to look at your pictures. One hears so much. Ronald laughed, a little too loudly. Village gossip. I'm the wicked seducer who drove poor Laura Chelmsford to her death. Ridiculous. She was old enough to be my mother. Yet she paid your rent and bought your canvases, Miss Marple said mildly. He shrugged. Patronage. It happens. She wanted to be amused. I let her think she was. He led her round the barn. There were landscapes, competent but cold. A series of village children that would have looked well on chocolate boxes, and then, propped against the far wall and half hidden by a piece of sacking, the portraits of Mrs. Chelmsford herself. There were 3. In the first, she sat on a gilt chair in a low-cut evening gown, diamonds at her throat, trying to look 35 and almost succeeding. In the second, she wore a Grecian drapery that left one shoulder bare and managed to be both dignified and startling. The third was unfinished. She reclined on a sofa, nude, one arm curved above her head, the pose borrowed from Goya's Maja. The flesh tints were delicate, the modeling tender. It was unmistakably a portrait painted with affection, perhaps even love. Miss Marple studied it for a long time. She was very beautiful, she said at last. Ronald turned away sharply. She was vain, possessive, and sometimes cruel. But yes, beautiful and lonely. I told her the nude was only an exercise in tone. She chose to believe it was adoration. And the quarrel? He lit a cigarette with unsteady fingers. She wanted marriage, or at the very least an announcement. I refused. She threatened to stop the allowance, burn the pictures, ruin me with the London galleries. I told her to do what she liked. Then I walked out. That was Saturday afternoon. I never saw her again. Miss Marple moved slowly about the studio, admiring brushes, peering into jars of pigment. Her gaze fell upon a coil of new hemp rope lying in the corner, still with the price ticket from Tillings in Much Benham, 3 shillings and 6pence a fathom. Beside it lay a patch of fresh green moss on the floorboards, as though something damp had recently rested there. "You bought rope recently, Mr. Thompson?" "For a backdrop. I'm planning a shipwreck, Turnerish. The moss is from the churchyard wall. I scrape it for greens." His tone was careless, but his eyes followed her. Miss Marple paused before a small table where tubes of paint lay jumbled with rags and a half-empty bottle of turpentine. Among the rags was something stiff and gray. She lifted it delicately between thumb and finger. The missing dove-gray kid glove, crumpled and stained with viridian and a darker smear that might have been blood. Ronald's face went very white. "That isn't mine. I've never seen it before." Miss Marple let the glove fall back among the rags. "Someone has been careless," she murmured. "Gloves are such revealing things, are they not? They keep the shape of the hand that wore them." She thanked him for the coffee and left him standing among his canvases, the smoke from his cigarette curling like a question mark toward the rafters. Outside, the afternoon had turned chilly. Miss Marple walked slowly back along the track, passing the churchyard where the yews leaned like old women gossiping. She stopped at the lich gate to rest and to think. Ronald Thompson had motive in plenty. Money, freedom, perhaps a younger woman somewhere. He had bought rope identical to that at the well. Moss on his floor could have come from the well stones. And now the missing glove, hidden clumsily among paint rags. It was almost too much evidence, too conveniently placed. She remembered a case long ago in which a murderer had hidden a blood-stained handkerchief in the pocket of the very man he wished to accuse. People who arrange tableaux, she reflected, sometimes over-arrange them. A bell rang for evensong. Rooks wheeled above the tower. Miss Marple tightened her scarf and set off toward the high street. She had one more call to make before dusk. At the Blue Boar, she found Inspector Craddock nursing a half-pint of mild and looking harassed. "Aunt Jane, I was coming to see you. That young painter has just telephoned in a panic. Says you found the missing glove in his studio. I'm on my way there now." Miss Marple laid a restraining hand on his sleeve. "Before you arrest anyone, Dermot dear, ask yourself who profits if Ronald Thompson is found with the glove. And ask who knew that Mrs. Chelmsford kept a second pair in the hall drawer, and who could walk into an artist's studio without exciting remark." Craddock stared at her. "You think the glove was planted?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone is being very clever indeed, and clever people, as we both know, sometimes make one tiny mistake." She left him standing in the doorway and walked on toward home, where Cherry had promised scones and blackberry jam. The studio, the rope, the moss, the hidden glove, all were pieces of a pattern, but the pattern was not yet complete. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was feeling very safe and perhaps just a little pleased with himself. Miss Marple smiled a small, determined smile. Overconfidence, she had noticed before, was the undoing of many a clever criminal. Chapter 6. The alibi that was too perfect Saturday brought a cold, steady rain that turned the lanes to mud and kept most of the village indoors, curtains half drawn, fires hissing. Miss Marple sat by her front window with a piece of plain knitting, a scarf for the overseas mission, and watched the comings and goings with the patience of a cat at a mouse hole. Cherry had gone to the pictures in Much Benham with her young man, so the cottage was quiet except for the tick of the grandmother clock and the occasional drip from the thatch. At 2:30, Inspector Craddock's little black Austin nosed cautiously into Danemead Lane and stopped at the gate. He arrived with wet shoulders and a folder of statements under his arm. "I've spent the morning taking proper alibis," he announced, shaking rain from his hat. "And the more I hear, the less I like it. They're all too good, Aunt Jane, too neat. Listen to this." He opened the folder. "Colonel Bantry. Bridge at the vicarage from 8 until 12:45. 4 witnesses, Vicar, Griselda, Miss Hartnell, and old Mr. Pye, who still plays a demon hand. They walked home together as far as the crossroads. Colonel swears he went straight to bed. His housekeeper heard him winding his watch at 1:05. Miss Caroline Weatherby left the theater in much Benham during the interval, complaining of a migraine, took the 9:42 bus home, alighted at the stop by the church at 10:10. Her daily woman, Mrs. Sims, was waiting up with a hot water bottle and saw her go straight upstairs. Door locked, no light after 10:30. Mr. Alfred Crackenthorpe claims he caught the midnight train from much Benham to London after dining at the Crown. Says he was annoyed with his sister-in-law and decided to return early. Ticket collector at Paddington remembers a gentleman in a bowler answering the description. Time 1:17 a.m. Ronald Thompson says he left his studio at 10 o'clock, walked home across the fields, and was in bed by 11. No one to confirm, but his landlady heard him moving about upstairs around 11:30. She was wakeful because of her rheumatism. Gladys Brent spent the entire evening in the kitchen at the Blue Boar with her aunt and uncle, crying into the washing up. At least 20 regulars saw her there until closing time. Craddock closed the folder with a snap. Every single one accounted for. Not a crack anywhere. Yet one of them is lying, and lying beautifully. Miss Marple laid her knitting in her lap. Or perhaps, she said softly, they are all telling the truth in the wrong order. Time is a slippery thing, Dermot. People remember what they expect to remember. Craddock frowned. You think the times are wrong? I think clocks are only as honest as the hands that set them. Tell me again about Miss Weatherby's migraine. Craddock consulted his notes. She told the woman sitting next to her, Mrs. Dudley from the Grange, that the second act was giving her a headache and she must leave. Mrs. Dudley offered to drive her, but Miss Weatherby said the fresh air would do her good and she would catch the 9:42 bus. Mrs. Dudley watched her walk toward the bus stop. And the bus conductor? Remembers her perfectly. Paid her fare, sat at the front, got off at the church. He particularly noticed because she was wearing a green wool coat with a hood, and most ladies wear hats. Miss Marple's needles began to move again. A green wool coat with a hood, she repeated. Yet on Monday evening she was seen walking toward the well wearing Mrs. Chelmsford's navy coat with the squirrel collar and a white rose. Curious, Craddock stared. You think she borrowed the coat? I think someone wished to be mistaken for Mrs. Chelmsford at a distance in the dark. The navy coat and the white rose were unmistakable, and someone else wished to be seen returning early in a green hooded coat that is also unmistakable. 2 women, 2 coats, 2 journeys, perhaps only 1 woman. Craddock began to pace the small room. Then the theater alibi is false? Not entirely. Miss Weatherby did go to the theater. She burned the ticket corner in Mrs. Price Ridley's grate. But she may have returned later on the last bus wearing Mrs. Chelmsford's coat. The conductor saw a woman in navy with a white flower. In the dark, from the top deck, one elderly lady looks very like another. Craddock stopped pacing. And the migraine? A convenient excuse to leave early, establish that she was unwell and ensure Mrs. Dudley would remember it. Then she waits somewhere, the church porch perhaps, changes coats, boards the 11:17 bus wearing the navy, is seen walking toward the well at midnight, and returns home in her own green coat after the deed. Mrs. Sims hears the front door at, say, 12:30, and assumes it is the same arrival she was told to expect at 10:10. Miss Marple poured him another cup of tea. But the chloral hydrate, Craddock objected. Haydock says it would have taken an hour to act fully. Exactly. Mrs. Chelmsford took her usual cachet when she came in from the theater. Gladys told me she always did when excited. By midnight she was confused, docile, An arm through hers, a murmured suggestion of a midnight wish at the old well. She would go like a child. Craddock sat down suddenly, and the glove planted in Ronald Thompson's studio. That was spite. Miss Weatherby has never approved of artists. 2 birds with 1 stone. Punish the immoral young man and deflect suspicion from herself. Miss Marple folded her knitting. The only question remaining is why she burned only the corner of the ticket. Vanity, I expect. She could not bear to destroy the whole. Seat J12, a good one near the aisle. So she tore off the date and seat number and convinced herself the rest was harmless. Craddock rose, energized. I'll have the bus conductors again, and Mrs. Dudley. And we'll search Miss Weatherby's house for the navy coat and the second glove. Miss Marple lifted a gentle hand. Not yet, Dermot. She is clever and she is watching. Let her feel safe a little longer. Murderers who believe their alibis perfect grow careless, and careless murderers make gifts of the evidence we need. The rain had eased to a drizzle. Craddock buttoned his mackintosh. You're sure it's her? Miss Marple looked toward the window where the drops slid like tears. I am sure of very little, dear boy. But I am sure that someone in this village has constructed an alibi so perfect that it creaks at every joint. And perfect things like perfect crimes seldom are. She picked up her knitting again, the needles flashing in the firelight. Give me until Tuesday. By then the pattern will show itself plainly. Craddock smiled, half in admiration, half in exasperation, and went out into the wet afternoon. Behind him the little clock ticked on, measuring the slow, inevitable hours until a murderer's careful house of cards should tremble and fall. Chapter 7. The Second Sixpence. Sunday morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of autumn day that makes the world look newly washed. The bells of St. Mary Mead called the faithful to matins, and Miss Marple, in her best dove-gray coat and the black straw hat with the velvet ribbon, walked to church with Cherry, who was still pink-cheeked from Saturday's cinema and the young baker's arm around her shoulders in the back row. The congregation was larger than usual. Tragedy draws people to church the way bees are drawn to foxgloves. Miss Caroline Weatherby sat in her accustomed place 3 pews from the front, upright as a guardsman, hymnal open, eyes fixed upon the east window with an expression of pious detachment. Colonel Bantry's mustache bristled in the choir stalls. Ronald Thompson, looking pale and interesting, had slipped in at the back. Gladys Brent, eyes swollen, knelt beside her aunt from the Blue Boar. Only the Krakenthorpe pew remained empty. The solicitor had returned to London on Friday, or so he said. Miss Marple listened to the familiar words of the service, sang the hymns in her soft, true soprano, and observed. Observation, she often said, was half prayer and half detection. After church, the village lingered on the path, unwilling to let the drama cool. Children ran whooping across the grass, and Tommy Pierce, restored to heroism, was demonstrating to a circle of admirers exactly how he had shinned down the fatal rope. Miss Marple settled herself on the bench beneath the yew tree, opened her prayer book as though to read the collect again, and waited. Tommy's audience grew restless. Clarence, the butcher's boy, produced a bright new sixpence from his pocket and offered double or quits. Tommy to go down once more and bring up a coin of his own choosing. Tommy needed no urging. He kicked off his boots, spat on his palms, and swung himself over the coping amid cheers. The well had been cleaned on Friday by order of the Rural District Council. The water, though still dark, was free of its terrible burden. Tommy descended rapidly, reached the bottom, and began groping among the silt and pennies. "Got one!" His voice echoed up the shaft. A moment later he reappeared, triumphant, holding aloft a shining sixpence. 1951, brand new, look! He scrambled out and ran to Miss Marple because everyone knew she was now the center of the mystery. "Here, miss, you have it, for luck." Miss Marple took the coin gravely. It was bright, unmarked except for one tiny detail. A deliberate scratch across the king's cheek, a neat little cross no larger than a pinprick. She turned it over twice, then closed her fingers upon it. "Thank you, Tommy. A very lucky sixpence indeed." The crowd dispersed toward Sunday dinner. Miss Marple remained on the bench, the two sixpences, Mrs. Chelmsford's and Tommy's, side by side on her palm. Identical minting, identical scratch. One had been clutched in a dying hand. The other had lain quietly at the bottom of the well. For how long? A week. Less? She slipped both coins into her handbag and walked home slowly, greeting neighbors, admiring babies, accepting a sprig of buried holly from old Mr. Pinker. At Mead cottage, she hung her coat with care and went straight to the small mahogany desk in the sitting room. From a locked drawer, she took a sheet of thin blue writing paper and her fountain pen. "My dear Dermot, come to tea on Tuesday without fail. Bring your notebook and an open mind. By then I shall have 2 sixpences and 1 white rose to show you, and I believe the pattern will be complete. Your affectionate J.M." She blotted the note, addressed the envelope to Scotland Yard's temporary headquarters at the Blue Boar, and gave it to Cherry to post at once. Monday passed in small domestic duties. The church flowers, a sick call to old Mrs. Elver, the stitching of a hem for Cherry's new winter dress. Miss Marple moved serenely through the village, stopping to chat, asking gentle questions, noticing everything. She noticed that Miss Weatherby had replaced the whitish roses in her sitting-room bowl with bronze chrysanthemums, though her garden still held several late white blooms. She noticed that Colonel Bantry's gardener had been instructed to dig up the entire rosebed nearest the boundary hedge because of greenfly. She noticed that Ronald Thompson had removed the unfinished nude portrait from his studio wall and replaced it with an innocuous view of the village pond. And on Monday afternoon, while pretending to search for windfalls beneath her own apple tree, she noticed a small, crumpled object half buried under the fallen leaves. A single dove-gray kid glove, the mate to the one found floating, its palm faintly stained with what might have been moss or verdigris. She picked it up with a folded piece of newspaper, carried it indoors, and placed it in a clean chocolate box lined with cotton wool. Tuesday dawned bright and windless. At 3:30, Inspector Craddock's car drew up outside Mead cottage. He came in rubbing his hands, half amused, half apprehensive. "Well, Aunt Jane, here I am. The chief constable is tearing his hair because the newspapers have got hold of the wishing well murderess and are hinting at an early arrest. I hope you have something for me." Miss Marple poured tea, Earl Grey today, and offered scones still warm from the oven. "I have 3 things," she said calmly. 2 sixpences, 1 glove, and a white rose. She laid them out on the lace cloth like a hand of cards. Craddock examined the coins first. "The second one, where did it come from?" "From the bottom of the well, brought up yesterday by Tommy Pierce. Both scratched in exactly the same place. You will recall that Miss Weatherby has a lifelong habit. She scratches a tiny cross on any coin she gives away for luck. She told her mother so when she was 7. Mrs. Dane Calthrop mentioned it to me only last year." Craddock turned the coins over thoughtfully. "And the glove?" "Found yesterday beneath my apple tree. The murderer walked across my garden after leaving Ronald Thompson's studio. A shortcut. The ground was soft after the rain. 1 glove caught on a bramble and was pulled off without being noticed." Craddock picked up the withered white rose she had placed beside the glove. "And this?" "Picked from Miss Weatherby's own bush at the foot of her garden steps. She cut 3 on Monday night. 1 for Mrs. Chelmsford's coat, 1 for the coping stone, and 1 perhaps intended for the church the next morning. She is always duty flower lady in her week." Miss Marple folded her hands. "The picture is now clear. Miss Weatherby went to the theater, established her migraine, left early. Hid in the church porch, met Mrs. Chelmsford when she returned on the last bus. Persuaded her, already confused by chloral, to walk to the well for a midnight wish. There she struck her with the bucket handle, lowered her with the rope from the studio, which she fetched earlier, leaving moss on the floor and the glove among the rags to incriminate Ronald, arranged the pathetic tableau, and walked home across the fields, dropping the second glove in my garden. Craddock drew a long breath. It fits. Every piece. Miss Marple looked toward the window where the last of the sunlight lay across the lawn. Then perhaps, Dermot dear, you might call upon Miss Weatherby tomorrow morning. Quietly. She is expecting triumph, not discovery. The shock will be severe. She reached for the teapot. Another cup before you go? And do try the blackcurrant jam. Cherry made it herself. Chapter 8. The Glove in the Rose Bed. Wednesday morning arrived with a hard, bright frost that turned every blade of grass into a silver needle. Inspector Craddock, accompanied by a silent sergeant from Much Benham, walked up the neat gravel path of Miss Caroline Weatherby's cottage at 9 o'clock precisely. The curtains were still half drawn. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney as though the occupant had only just risen. Craddock knocked 3 times, firm but courteous. Miss Weatherby opened the door herself. She wore a quilted dressing gown of maroon velvet and an expression of mild surprise that did not quite conceal the wariness in her pale eyes. Inspector Craddock, at this hour? Has something happened? May we come in, Miss Weatherby? A few questions, nothing more. She hesitated the length of a heartbeat, then stood aside. The little sitting room was exactly as Miss Marple had described it. Horsehair sofa, walnut whatnot, a bowl of bronze chrysanthemums replacing the white roses. A small fire burned in the grate. The air smelled of toast and lavender water. Craddock removed his hat. We have found the second glove, Miss Weatherby, the right-hand one. It was buried beneath Colonel Bantry's rosebed, wrapped in withered petals to keep its shape. Miss Weatherby's hand flew to her throat. Colonel Bantry's, but that is absurd. Why would... Because someone wished us to think the colonel guilty, Craddock said quietly. Someone who knew he quarreled with Mrs. Chelmsford, who had access to his garden, and who cut white roses from her own bush to plant with the glove. The stems were cut from upper left to lower right, right-handed, Miss Weatherby, exactly as you hold your secateurs. Color drained from her face, leaving it the shade of old parchment. I have never... Craddock continued as though she had not spoken. We also have 2 sixpences, both scratched with the same small cross. One was in Mrs. Chelmsford's hand. The other lay at the bottom of the well until Sunday. You have scratched coins that way since childhood. Mrs. Dane Calthrop remembers it clearly. Miss Weatherby sat down very suddenly on the horsehair sofa. There is the rope, Craddock went on. Bought by Mr. Thompson for a backdrop, but removed from his studio on Monday evening and returned before he noticed. The moss on his floorboards matches the moss on the well stones. And the glove we found among his paint rags, your glove, Miss Weatherby, was still damp when it was planted there. He laid the chocolate box Miss Marple had given him on the table and opened it. The dove-gray glove lay inside like an accusation. Miss Weatherby stared at it for a long moment. Then she lifted her head with a strange dignity. Very clever, Inspector. And Miss Marple, of course. I might have known that sentimental old woman would unravel it. She always did fancy herself omniscient. Craddock said nothing. Miss Weatherby rose and walked to the window. The frost was beginning to melt in the sun. Drops slid slowly down the panes. I shall make a statement, she said at last, but only because I choose to, not because you have forced me. Laura Chelmsford was a wicked woman. She corrupted youth, mocked decency, and flaunted her immorality beneath the very windows of respectable people. She intended to leave money to that painter so that he might continue his disgusting daubs. I warned her, anonymously at first, then openly. She laughed. On Monday night she came home flushed with triumph from the theater, full of plans to change her will the very next week. I met her from the bus. She was already confused, the chloral, you know. I suggested a midnight visit to the old well. She thought it romantic. One blow, and it was over. The rest, the rose, the floating hand, was meant to look like suicide. A moment of despair. The village would have understood. Her voice was perfectly steady. I did it for the moral good of St. Mary Mead. Someone had to. Craddock took out his notebook. Caroline Weatherby, I must caution you. She waved a hand impatiently. Yes, yes, I know the formula. I shall come quietly. Only allow me to dress and to leave a note for my daily woman. She has a key. The milk must be taken in. She went upstairs with the same measured tread she used when carrying the collection plate on the first Sunday of the month. The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. Shall I go up, sir? Craddock listened to the small sounds overhead. Drawers opening, the creak of a wardrobe, water running. Give her 5 minutes, she has her pride. 4 minutes later, Miss Weatherby descended. She wore her green wool coat with the hood, a neat felt hat, and dove-gray gloves. New ones, Craddock noticed, identical to the pair that had caused her downfall. She carried a small suitcase and an envelope addressed in firm black script. For the vicar, she said, handing it to Craddock. Instructions about my funeral. Nothing elaborate, the 23rd Psalm, and no flowers except white roses from my own garden. In the police car, she sat very straight between the two men, looking neither right nor left. As they passed the well, she glanced once at the little bunch of Michaelmas daisies now tied with a black ribbon, and her lips moved soundlessly. At the station, she gave her statement without hesitation or remorse, signed it with a fountain pen she produced from her handbag, and asked whether she might have a cup of tea while the necessary forms were completed. Craddock, watching her drink it with milk and 2 sugars exactly as she had done all her life, felt an odd pang. Murder, he thought, is a terrible thing, but it is also terribly human. By noon the news was all over the village. Mrs. Price Ridley fainted clean away in the post office and had to be revived with sal volatile. Colonel Bantry was heard to exclaim, "Well, I'll be damned," 3 times in succession. Ronald Thompson shut himself in his studio and was observed through the window to be painting with unusual violence. Gladys Brent wept afresh, this time with relief. Miss Marple heard the church clock strike 12, laid aside her knitting and walked down to the police house to offer Cherry's seed cake to the exhausted constables. She did not ask for details. She already knew them all. Outside, the frost had melted entirely. A pale sun shone on the old wishing well, and the water, seen from above, looked almost blue. Somewhere a blackbird sang as though nothing in the world had changed, and in a sense, nothing had. St. Mary Mead would gossip for a month, mourn decorously, and then fold the whole sad business away like a best tablecloth used only for funerals. The well would grant no more wishes, but it would keep its secret, and the white roses would bloom again next summer exactly as before. Only Miss Marple, walking home with her umbrella tapping gently on the path, knew that justice, like knitting, is achieved one small inevitable stitch at a time. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room at Dane Mead. Tuesday, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the low autumn sun slanted through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's little drawing room, laying pale gold bars across the turkey carpet. The fire crackled with apple wood. Cherry had just carried in the tea tray. Best Crown Derby, seed cake still warm, paper-thin bread and butter, black currant jam shining like garnets in the cut glass dish. Everything was ready. They arrived separately, each pretending the invitation had been casual. each betraying by a flicker of eye or tightening of mouth that they knew this was no ordinary tea. Colonel Bantry came first, blustering about the weather and the iniquities of the county council. Miss Caroline Weatherby followed, upright in her green wool coat, a felt hat pinned firmly above her iron-gray bun. Ronald Thompson slouched in wearing a paint-stained jersey, cigarette already between his fingers. Gladys Brent, eyes red but curiously defiant, was escorted by her aunt from the Blue Boar, who deposited her and left with suspicious haste. Mr. Alfred Crackenthorpe had been summoned by telegram from London and arrived last, bowler hat in hand, thin mouth set in permanent disapproval. Inspector Craddock stood quietly by the mantelpiece, notebook closed, hands behind his back like a polite footman. Miss Marple greeted each one with her usual gentle murmur, pressed them into chairs, poured tea, offered cake. Only when every cup was filled and the room quiet except for the ticking of the clock did she lay her knitting aside and begin. "You are wondering why I asked you all here," she said pleasantly. "It is quite simple. One of you murdered Laura Chelmsford, and the time has come for the truth to be spoken aloud." A small collective intake of breath. Colonel Bantry's mustache bristled. Miss Weatherby sat very straight. Ronald stubbed his cigarette with unnecessary force. Miss Marple lifted the chocolate box from the side table and opened it. "This is the right-hand glove. It was found yesterday beneath my own apple tree, having been pulled off by a bramble as the wearer crossed my garden after leaving Mr. Thompson's studio. The left-hand glove floated in the well, buttoned, because the murderer wished us to notice it. The right-hand glove was intended to disappear." She laid the glove on the tea tray like an exhibit. "2 sixpences," she continued, placing them beside the glove. "One was in Mrs. Chelmsford's hand when she was brought up. The second was retrieved from the bottom of the well on Sunday. Both are scratched with the identical small cross. Since childhood, Miss Weatherby has marked every coin she gives away in that manner. It is a harmless superstition, but habits, as we know, outlast prudence." Miss Weatherby set her cup down with a click. "Coincidence," she said crisply. "Many people scratch coins." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "But not many people in St. Mary Mead cut white roses with a right-handed slant, or keep 2 pairs of dove-gray kid gloves, or burn only the corner of a theater ticket because vanity will not let them destroy the whole." She turned to the company. "Mrs. Chelmsford went to the theater alone on Monday night. She returned on the 11:17 bus, already confused by chloral hydrate she had taken herself after an exciting evening. Someone met her at the crossroads wearing her own navy coat and carrying a white rose, articles borrowed earlier from the Hall of the Laurels. That someone persuaded her to walk to the wishing well for a midnight wish. A single blow from the iron bucket handle rendered her unconscious. She was lowered into the water with rope taken from Mr. Thompson's studio, rope bought for a painting but never used. Moss on the studio floor and a planted glove were meant to incriminate the artist." Ronald Thompson went very white. Miss Marple's gentle voice went on. The tableau was completed. One gloved hand floating, a white rose on the coping stone, a scratched sixpence in the dead woman's fingers. The murderer walked home across the fields, dropping the second glove in my garden without noticing. The navy coat was returned to its peg before morning. She looked directly at Miss Weatherby. "You established your migraine at the theater, Miss Weatherby, left early, hid in the church porch until the last bus, changed coats, and became Mrs. Chelmsford for the space of half an hour. Then you changed back, walked home in your green coat, and were safely in bed long before the body was discovered." A long silence. The fire settled with a small shower of sparks. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Good God," he said faintly. Miss Weatherby rose. For a moment she seemed taller, almost majestic. "Very clever, Miss Marple. You have constructed a pretty story from scraps and gossip. But you have no proof. Miss Marple opened a second, smaller box and took out a withered white rose. This was cut from the bush at the foot of your own garden steps on Monday night. The cut is identical to those on the roses found with the buried glove. Your secateurs, Miss Weatherby, have a tiny nick on the lower blade. Inspector Craddock has them now. Craddock inclined his head. Miss Weatherby looked round the room at the shocked faces, the averted eyes, the trembling teacups, and something seemed to leave her. The ramrod spine softened. The corners of her mouth drooped. "Yes," she said at last, quite composed. "I did it. She was a corrupting influence. The village is cleaner without her." Gladys gave a small, broken cry. Ronald Thompson swore under his breath. Colonel Bantry stared as though a favorite aunt had turned into a cobra. Miss Marple's voice was softer than ever. "Murder is never clean, Miss Weatherby. It leaves stains that no amount of moral righteousness will wash away." Craddock stepped forward. "Caroline Weatherby, I arrest you for the murder of Laura Chelmsford." She did not hear the rest. She was looking out of the window at the quiet village street where children played hopscotch and a dog slept in the sun. "White roses," she murmured. "I shall miss my white roses." Cherry, round-eyed in the doorway, began to cry quietly. Miss Marple reached for the teapot. "Perhaps," she said gently. "Another cup before you go, Inspector. The seed cake is particularly good today." Chapter 10. Seed Cake and Explanations. A week later, the village had folded itself back into its familiar rhythms, the way a hedgehog curls tight after danger has passed. The frost had softened into a mild, almost spring-like drizzle. The Michaelmas daisies by the well were sodden but still tied with their black ribbon, and the rural district council had nailed a neat board over the mouth of the well until further notice. Life, as Miss Marple often observed, is remarkably resilient. At Dane Mead Cottage the fire was bright, the lamps lit early against the gray afternoon, and Cherry had surpassed herself. 2 kinds of sandwich, scones with clotted cream, black currant jam, and a seed cake so fragrant that it drew Inspector Craddock up the path 10 minutes sooner than courtesy required. He arrived with damp shoulders and the faintly sheepish air of a man who knows he has been brilliantly out-detected. "Aunt Jane, I come as a penitent. The chief constable has stopped shouting, the newspapers have gone away, and Miss Weatherby has made a full confession signed in triplicate. I am officially redundant." Miss Marple smiled and relieved him of his wet coat. "Nonsense, Dermot, dear. You were invaluable. Murderers are much more likely to confess to a tall young man in a good suit than to a little old lady with knitting needles. Sit by the fire and have some tea." Cherry poured, added 2 sugars exactly as he liked, and withdrew beaming. Craddock accepted a generous slice of seed cake and waited. He had learned long ago that explanations from Miss Marple arrived in their own good time. She settled herself opposite him, hands folded in her lap like a small gray bird. "You wish to know how I knew it was Miss Weatherby from the beginning. I wish to know how you knew before there seemed anything to know," he corrected. Miss Marple considered this, head on one side. "It was the white rose, really. White roses in late September are not picked carelessly. They are the last of the summer and therefore precious. To cut 3, 1 for the coat, 1 for the coping stone, 1 perhaps for the church the next morning, and then to leave 2 of them as part of a theatrical effect argued a very particular temperament. Vanity, righteousness, and a love of symbolism. Miss Weatherby has always arranged the altar flowers when it is her week. She believes in the significance of such things." Craddock nodded, mouth full of seed cake. "Then the glove," Miss Marple continued, "only 1 floating, buttoned, yet the 6pence clenched tightly. A buttoned glove cannot clench. Someone dressed the scene after death. And who in St. Mary Mead is precise enough to notice gloves and vain enough to own two identical pairs against accidents? Again, Miss Weatherby. She reached for the teapot. The scratched sixpences confirmed it. When Tommy brought up the second on Sunday, I knew the murderer had dropped both. One into the dead hand for pathos, one into the water to be rid of it. And that only Miss Weatherby marked coins that way. The rest followed naturally. Craddock brushed crumbs from his knee. The planted glove in Ronald Thompson's studio was almost too clever. Pride, Miss Marple said softly. She despised him and wished him punished along with Mrs. Chelmsford. Two immoral people removed at one stroke. She walked across my garden because it is the shortest way from the tithe barn to her cottage, never thinking the damp ground would betray her. She offered the plate again. Craddock took another slice without shame. "And the coat?" he asked. "Simple borrowing. Mrs. Chelmsford always left her hall unlocked. Everyone in the village knew it. Miss Weatherby took the navy coat and the white rose on Monday afternoon, hid in the church porch until the last bus, changed in the darkness and became Mrs. Chelmsford for half an hour. Afterward, she hung the coat back on its peg. The squirrel collar was distinctive even by moonlight." Craddock leaned back, replete. "I still can't decide whether it was madness or ice-cold calculation." "Both," Miss Marple said. "She has always believed herself the appointed guardian of village morals. When Mrs. Chelmsford threatened to corrupt youth and rewrite her will in favor of an artist, Miss Weatherby felt justified. In her own eyes, she was not murdering. She was cleansing." A silence fell, comfortable and sad. Outside, the rain whispered against the windows. Craddock stirred. "She has asked for no visitors except the vicar, and she has instructed her solicitor to leave her white rose bush to the churchyard, to be planted on her grave when the time comes." Miss Marple's eyes were suddenly bright. Poor Caroline. She will be remembered for her roses rather than her righteousness, and perhaps that is mercy. Cherry came in to clear the tea things and announced that the baker's young man had proposed in the pictures on Saturday, and she had said yes. Congratulations filled the little room. Craddock produced a half bottle of sherry he happened to have in the car, and for a few minutes murder seemed very far away. When he rose to leave, the lamps were glowing and the rain had stopped. At the door, he paused. "One last thing, Aunt Jane. How did you know the second sixpence would appear?" Miss Marple smiled, small and wise. "My dear Dermot, children are wonderfully predictable. Give Tommy Pierce an audience and a dare, and he would go down that well until doomsday. Murderers may be clever, but 14-year-old boys are gloriously single-minded." Craddock laughed outright and kissed her cheek. "You are a witch," he said fondly. "No," Miss Marple replied, closing the door softly behind him. "Only an old maid who has lived a long time in a village and noticed how people behave." She returned to the fireside, picked up her knitting, and listened to the church clock strike 6. Somewhere in the distance, a blackbird practiced its spring song, though winter was barely begun. The seed cake was finished, the mystery solved, the world set quietly to rights. Tomorrow there would be the Women's Institute, a new library book from Much Benham, and perhaps a letter from her nephew Raymond in America. Life would go on, serene and commonplace and secretly rather dangerous, exactly as she liked it. Miss Marple's needles clicked peacefully. Another small human drama had ended, as all such dramas do, over tea and seed cake in an English village where nothing ever happened. Until, of course, the next time.